U-534. Only 4 intact German U-boats still exist in the world today, but U-534 almost didn't make it into that famous foursome. Treasure hunters thought that the boat may have held Nazi riches due to its final actions in service, and so they dredged it up after it lied on the bottom of the ocean for decades. When World War II was coming to a close, U-534, the last U-boat to leave Germany, was informed that they should surrender. However, for some reason, the submarine refused to do so. Instead, the ship and 2 speedier submarines accelerated in the direction of Norway. Sadly for the crew, British planes easily sank U-534 after quickly catching up with the boats. A few of the 59 crew members on board the sub managed to escape by squeezing through the torpedo tubes like human missiles, and in total, a surprising 44 people made it out alive, although it's still unclear why they didn't just surrender. Ege Jensen, a Danish wreck hunter, found the U-534's wreck in 1986. A Dutch salvage business brought her to the surface in 1993, nearly 50 years after she had been dropped to the ocean floor. Even though there was a decent amount of speculation and rumors regarding the U-boat's last mission and what riches the ship may have contained, no gold, stolen art, or sign of any fugitive Nazi war criminals were discovered. However, what they did find in the vessel was still pretty cool. Led by Jensen, the salvage crew discovered a bunch of explosives, 13 torpedoes, 2 Enigma encryption machines, intriguing documents, as well as some personal items like chess sets, photographs, cigars, and songbooks. U-534 was, in essence, a time capsule. The boat was eventually dismantled and transported in pieces to Birkenhead in 1996, where it's now the focal point of the U-boat story exhibition. Each piece of the vessel may now be observed, and the sub's narrative can be explored in full. Yet, to this day, no one that's visited the display has been able to explain the enigma of why the sub refused to die. Raising of K-129. If you're a fan of 007 and submarines, the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. has you covered. Hidden in plain sight in a corner exhibit of the museum, a submarine control panel is on display, and it's accompanied by a swoopy banged wig, a piece of manganese, and some detailed white prints. These items together constitute remnants of a daring Cold War robbery mission that the museum's curator, Vince Houghton, views as incredibly audacious. Under the covert Project Azorian mission, the CIA commissioned the building of a 600-foot ship to recover a submerged Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean. When the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129 mysteriously vanished in the Pacific Ocean in 1968, a 6-year expedition began. Both American and Soviet submarines patrolled the open waters carrying nuclear weapons in this post-Cuban Missile Crisis era, ready for a future conflict. While the Soviets formerly accused the Americans of involvement in foul play, other stories indicated that the sinking was caused by a mechanical malfunction, such as an accidental missile engine firing. The U.S., which had previously utilized Air Force equipment to find 2 of its own sunken submarines, was able to pinpoint the K-129 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii and 16,500 feet below the water. The Soviet Union had given up its hunt for the K-129 and the nuclear warheads it carried after only 2 months. The declassified CIA history of the project claims that no nation in the world has ever before been able to raise an item of this weight and size from such a depth. Even though the submarine delivered a tempting treasure of information, the intelligence community internally debated the cost-to-reward ratio of such a costly and dangerous effort. Houghton said that the K-129's significance came from more than simply the code books and nuclear bombs it carried, but an opportunity had also presented itself which would allow the U.S. to understand how the submarines of the opposing nation were made. The U.S. could potentially improve its ability to identify the K-129 if it knew how its sonar equipment worked or how the submarine remained silent. The CIA came up with various crazy ideas about how to recover the sunken submarine. One idea suggested producing enough gas beneath the ocean's floor to buoy the submarine to the surface. Instead, they decided on a design that was evocative of an old arcade game, a huge claw that would grab the K-129 and pull it into the belly of a huge ship. At first, the initiative was projected to have only a 10% success rate. After careful consideration by the Secretary of Defense and the White House, President Nixon approved the salvage attempt when given the rare chance to retrieve it secretly from the Soviet Union. The CIA was requested to lead the operation rather than the Navy in order to keep the salvage attempt black or secret. Under a CIA contract, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was created and constructed specifically for the covert recovery of K-129. The ship would be mining manganese nodules on the ocean floor, according to the cover story. This recovery mission was one of the priciest and darkest secrets of the Cold War. From Long Beach, California, the ship traveled 3,008 miles to the location of the recovery site. According to one story, the Hughes Glomar Explorer grappled with the wreck of K-129 in the spring of 1974 and was able to lift the forward half of it. However, as it was being raised, the claw experienced a critical failure, which caused the forward section to break into two pieces. As a result, the crucial sail area and center section were sent falling back to the ocean floor. Consequently, it's claimed that K-129's central sail area and after portions were not found. The precise contents of the recovered section seemed to be top secret, although the Soviets believed that torpedoes with nuclear warheads, operating manuals, code books, and coding machines were among the items that were found. Unofficially, according to another source, the Americans retrieved the bow portion of the ship, which was home to a couple nuclear torpedoes but no cryptography tools or code books. The massive submarine raising mission appeared to have gone smoothly for the United States, as Ford's Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger declared in a meeting at the White House. The Glomar Explorer was being used as a front by Hughes Summa Corporation, which was randomly robbed in early 1975. The whole incident ended up making national headlines in the Los Angeles Times and on television. The story came out a lot later than it should have, since famous New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh had been tracking it since 1973, but had honored a request from CIA Director William Colby to hide it. And when the mission was leaked, it was riddled with a large amount of inaccuracies. That spring, the CIA also encountered a diplomatic conundrum. They intended to avoid directly admitting that they had illegally taken a submarine from the monitoring Soviets, but they were compelled to react in some way after being pressed by the Soviet ambassador to the United States and Freedom of Information Act requests from the media. The Glomar response, "We can neither confirm nor deny," was created in an effort to tread this delicate diplomatic line and adhere to FOIA regulations. Project Azorian is still regarded as legendary among the intelligence community, 45 years after the Glomar Explorer recovered part of the K-129 from the ocean floor. Glass cases on display now contain items like crew members' onesies, fake safety awards, a barometer, and even a wig worn by CIA Deputy Director Vernon Walters during an undercover visit to the Glomar Explorer. They also feature a scaled version of the detailed blueprint used to design the now non-functioning ship and a mention of engineer John Graham. According to Halfton, because Azorian was so daring, ambitious, and practically doomed to fail, it stood out. However, despite only being able to recover a portion of the submarine, the ship was built and the almost absurd idea of a giant claw reaching down to the ocean floor proved practical. And given the project's size, the whole thing surprisingly managed to stay a secret for 7 years. The Azorian story is portrayed by the Spy Museum as an ode to ingenuity and as an example of how the unsolvable challenges of the intelligence community may be solved through inventiveness and modern technology. Would you ever visit the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C.? Let us know in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. USS S-51. The crew on board the USS S-51 submarine were sleeping in their bunks for the majority of the night of September 25, 1925. The S-class submarine, now well into her third year of service, was on a mission toward the Atlantic and was trudging along the surface close to Rhode Island. That night, the steamship known as the City of Rome approached the port with its light on. The watch crew on S-51 reasonably anticipated that the steamer would alter its course because the submarine had the right of way. However, the City of Rome continued to get closer. It was already too late when the crews of both ships realized they were about to collide with one another. The crew had mere seconds to flee after the steamer crashed into S-51, ripping open a gash in its hull and quickly flooding the ship. Only 3 of the men lived to tell the tale, and a total of 33 sailors died as a result. The accident came at the absolute worst time, as the Navy Department was already experiencing a flood of public criticism. A few weeks prior to the incident, a Navy officer flying the first nonstop journey to Hawaii in a seaplane ran out of fuel and disappeared. In the end, the pilot was saved. Even worse, the USS Shenandoah, a Navy airship, had just sunk in Ohio, killing all 14 members of its crew. The public and the sailing branch both urged that S-51 and the crew's bodies be recovered from the water. Rear Admiral Edward Ellsberg was assigned the mission's leadership by the Navy. On the open sea, this practice was unheard of. Using diving gear from the 1920s, Ellsberg's team would spend months diving to S-51, which sat at 132 feet below the surface. The submarine might as well have been on the moon by today's standards. It would take astronaut-level bravery to board it. The strategy called for frequent dives into S-51, and they closed off as many of her internal compartments as possible, emptying the water to give buoyancy. Nevertheless, some compartments couldn't be sealed due to their severe damage. The crew then attached pontoons and raised her up after spending months living in a tiny flotilla of tugboats, rescuing and repairing ships. However, the task was tedious and discouraging due to the high risk of diving operations and bad weather. On June 5, 1926, the salvage crew finally raised S-51 and towed her to New York. But before that, the most challenging duty was digging 2 tunnels beneath the submarine, where the sailors ran chains to hold on to the bottom of the ship. The submarine needed to be dug out of the muck and clay, but using picks and shovels would have been too taxing and difficult given the heavy, uncomfortable diving suits. Instead, the sailors attacked the soil with high-pressure water hoses. The risks associated with this choice were extremely dangerous. Progress was hindered, but the hoses remained under control when the water pressure was reduced. Ellsberg then called Francis Smith, a tunneling sailor who had a terrifying near-death experience. He was buried 135 feet under the water's surface in ice-cold water, complete darkness, and complete loneliness. The only sense he had was the sensation of the iron hull of the S-51 pressing into his back as he lay stretched out flat in a tiny hole that was barely wider than his torso and too small for him to turn around in. While a dark torrent of ice-cold water that was heavy with muck and clay flowed backward around him, he grabbed the high-pressure water nozzle and dug his way further. Smith eventually emerged from the tunnel after a grueling period of time. Somehow, Smith had managed to slide the nozzle back between his knees despite being unable to turn around, and by manipulating it with his feet, he had washed his way out of the cave-in backwards. Smith took a few minutes to relax on the ocean floor before picking up his hose, making his way back into the tube, and continuing to wash his way towards the keel for another 30 minutes. Francis Smith displayed incredible bravery when, in the still waters of the ocean beneath the wreck of the S-51, he washed himself out of what might have been his final resting place. Then, with deliberate action, he turned around and returned to the black hole from which he had escaped, working his way deeper and deeper into it. No act ever carried out in the heat of battle where thousands cheer you on can compare to this story. In the end, the submarine was dismantled and the remains of the lost sailors were taken out. The hulk was eventually purchased by the Burrow Metal Company of Brooklyn, New York on June 4, 1930 for $3,320. The Kursk disaster. On August 12, 2000, a Russian nuclear submarine sank to the bottom of the Barents Sea. Afterwards, all 118 crew members were discovered to be dead. The exact reasons for the catastrophe still remains unknown to this day. On August 10, 2000, the Kursk sailed out of port to engage in war games with the Russian military. In order to perform military maneuvers, Russian aircraft, ships, and submarines gather in the Barents Sea, which is located above the Arctic Circle. Before firing a practice torpedo on August 12, Kursk had 2 unexplained explosions in its front hull that were closely spaced apart. As a result, the submarine was plunged toward the ocean floor. The Kursk was 500 feet long and carried 24,000 tons of weight. It could go at 28 knots and had 2 nuclear reactors. It was the biggest attack submarine in the whole world, over 3 times bigger than the largest submarines in the U.S. Navy. Numerous countries volunteered to aid in the rescue operation because it was uncertain what would become of the 118 Russian crew members who were on board the Kursk. However, the stubborn Russian government declined all offers of assistance. A week later, divers eventually reached Kursk, but they discovered no evidence of life. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, gave in to intense pressure and agreed to raise the submarine from the bottom of the water for an examination, despite the fact that no ship or item of such scale had ever been brought up from the depths of the ocean. The operation also had a very narrow window of opportunity, mostly due to the Barents Sea remaining frozen for most of the year.
5. Raven Rock. Built near Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania during the early 1950s, the Raven Rock Mountain Complex, RRMC, is a highly restricted US military site with a bunker below it, nicknamed the Underground Pentagon. Also called Site R, it was intended as a place for the American government to operate from during a nuclear war. In his book, Raven Rock, the story of the US government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die, the author Garrett Graff describes how the 650-acre property resembles a small city built into a hollowed-out mountain. Made up of several buildings, it has its own fire department, police department, medical facilities, a dining hall that operates 24/7, electricity plants, a ventilation system, and water reservoirs. In the event of a national catastrophe, Raven Rock would house members of the Pentagon. While there are at least 100 staff members on site at any given time, the facility is capable of housing as many as 5,000 people. Its use diminished during the 90s as the Cold War ended, but the bunker was restored to active use and expanded after former Vice President Dick Cheney went there during the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. Raven Rock is part of a network of bunkers all designed for similar purposes, including the Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center, CMOC in Colorado, and the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia. And while its existence is publicly known, knowledge of what goes on there is totally off limits to outsiders. Government officials have disclosed that several agencies operate out of Raven Rock, including the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the 114th Signal Battalion, and the Defense Information Systems Agency. 4. Brier Bunker. As the Cold War arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified, the prospect of nuclear warfare became increasingly realistic in the minds of many. Both superpowers embarked on bunker-building frenzies in an attempt to provide both elites and civilians with safe places to go if these fears became a reality. American leaders put a lot of focus into having a safe place for the president and other high-ranking officials to go in the event of a nuclear catastrophe. They made it a top priority to ensure that the government could continue to function during a war. Construction on one such congressional bunker began under the Eisenhower administration during the late 1950s at the Brier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The location was chosen for its relative close proximity to Washington, D.C., and because it was far enough away to be safe if a nuclear bomb struck the nation's capital. Nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the luxury resort was a hotspot among important and wealthy people in both the private and public sectors. To prevent employees and the surrounding town of 3,000 residents from becoming suspicious, the bunker's construction was disguised as part of a new wing that was being built. However, the amount of materials arriving at the property seemed like a lot, even for an entirely new wing. Locals began to suspect that the increased activity reflected more than just an effort to accommodate the rich and famous. They grew even more skeptical when a 7,000-foot runway was built, although anyone they asked about it denied its existence. Nobody would admit to anything, and their questions went unanswered for decades. The two-level bunker sits roughly 720 feet below ground and is estimated to be at least the size of a modern-day Walmart. It's hidden in plain sight behind a door with a sign on the outside that says "Danger, High Voltage, Keep Out," and is protected by blast-proof doors that weigh as much as 28 tons. It also requires at least 50 pounds of force to open. In the event of a nuclear attack, members of Congress would first visit the decontamination room, where they'd strip, shower, and put on a fresh, clean outfit. If disaster struck, each of the bunker's 18 dormitories consisted of 60 metal bunk beds that would accommodate every member of the House and Senate, along with other important members of government. There were around 1,100 beds in total, and enough food and water for 1,000 people to last roughly 60 days. Additionally, the site housed a large hall for congressional meetings, 2 separate auditoriums, one each for the Senate and the House of Representatives, a kitchen, a 400-seat cafeteria, offices, a records room, a hospital and operating room, a pharmacy, and radio and TV communication facilities. On top of all that, there was also a modest weapon supply, a small jail, and some straitjackets, just in case. When the property's historian Bob Conti took the position in 1978, he was immediately bombarded with suspicious questions. At the time, Conti had what he thought was full access to the building's plan and details, and there was no evidence of a secret bunker. He denied that it existed not because he was hiding anything, but because he was unaware of its presence himself. Over time, Conti noticed things about Brier that simply didn't make sense. For one, there were a lot of bathrooms, and most of them were designated for men. Conti also found it strange that there were about a dozen employees of a local TV company always hanging around the property. As it turned out, they were government workers in disguise who were tasked with maintaining the bunker. Washington Post journalist Ted Gupp revealed the existence of the Brier bunker in 1992 in a shocking exposé. Once its cover was blown, it was taken out of official use. Today, it's open to the public for tours. The bunker was never used for its intended purpose and remains almost exactly how it was left, complete with its original furnishings and supplies. Do you think you could live in an enclosed space underground for an uncertain amount of time, or do you think you'd go crazy? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're enjoying the video, hit that subscribe button. 3. Culpeper Switch. The Culpeper Switch was built in 1969 outside the small town of Culpeper, Virginia, and was a sprawling 135,000 square foot top-secret bunker that was designed to keep banks running in the event of a nuclear attack or war. Officially known as the Federal Reserve System's Communications and Record Center, it housed the world's largest single-floor vault with $4 billion of newly printed cash inside. To put that into perspective, That's enough US currency to replenish the money supply in the part of the country that falls east of the Mississippi River. A large portion of the cash consisted of stacks of $2 bills that were shrink-wrapped and stacked 9 feet high. The $6 million facility also had a highly advanced computer system that was capable of processing electronic transfers known as the Fedwire, ensuring that the federal bank could continue running somewhat normally if catastrophe struck. Designed to house 500 Federal Reserve employees and their families, the bunker was equipped with its own air filtration system and power generators, and was stocked with enough food and water to last for 1 month at full capacity. It only had 200 bunks, meaning people would have to take turns using the same bed and sleep in shifts, a practice known as hot bedding. The property also had a shooting range, a helipad, and cold storage for bodies in case anyone passed away while staying down there, especially in case it wasn't safe to leave and bury them elsewhere. While the bunker was never used for housing government employees during an apocalyptic scenario, the Federal Reserve did use it for routing bank transactions during the 1970s and 80s. In fact, it got its name as the Culpeper switch because it functioned as the switching station for the Federal Reserve's electronic transfer system. Knowledge of its existence became widespread during the mid-1970s. Many Americans were highly skeptical of the idea of such a large amount of money being in the hands of a small number of people, causing them to question whether the arrangement would truly benefit society in a time of economic distress. The cash was removed from the bunker in 1988, and the Federal Reserve moved out during the early 90s. After an unsuccessful attempt to sell it on the private market, it was donated to the Library of Congress. It was later repurposed as a national archive that housed movie, TV, and music recordings, known as the National Audio-Visual Conservation Center. 2. Cheyenne Mountain Complex. Located near the Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex is a defensive bunker that was built during the 1950s. Situated deep within a mountain roughly 7,000 feet above sea level, the 5-acre site was originally intended as a hardened command and control center against long-range Soviet bombers. It sits beneath 2,000 feet of granite and is one of the most secure facilities in the United States. Protected by massive 25-ton blast-proof doors, the property consists of 15 three-story buildings, which are protected from earthquake or explosion-related movement by a sophisticated system of giant springs. In the event of a man-made or natural disaster, none of the buildings should move more than an inch. Capable of resisting a 30-megaton nuclear explosion from as close as 1.2 miles away, Cheyenne Mountain is the only high-altitude Department of Defense facility equipped to withstand a burst of radiation known as an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. The complex consists of indoor and outdoor amenities, including a bunker with enough cots for most employees, suites for high-ranking personnel, fitness centers, volleyball and basketball courts, a medical facility, a store, a cafeteria, and lots of security. It's equipped with 6 generators, its own heating and cooling systems, a water supply, an escape hatch for emergencies, a diesel fuel reservoir, a communication center, and everything else it needs to run on its own for an extended period of time. If Cheyenne Mountain had to close down due to an emergency notice, employees would follow a procedure called button up. The facility contains closets filled with emergency supplies that would be used in the event of having to button up. It also had a massive water reservoir that would help the complex maintain a cool interior temperature. The facility even had its own group of firefighters who underwent highly specialized training on how to combat fires in the unique bunker. In its early years, the site functioned as a North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and United States Northern Command US Northcom Monitoring Center. It also served as a worldwide early warning system for any unwelcome presence in US and Canadian airspace, including ballistic missiles, space systems, and potential attacks by foreign aircraft. In 2008, NORAD and US Northcom headquarters were relocated to nearby Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. Today, Cheyenne Mountain operates as a landlord for various government agencies, including the Space Force and the Defense Intelligence Agency. However, it remains a protector of American and Canadian airspace and houses an air operations center, a weather support center, a national warning facility, a space control center, a combined intelligence watch center, and much more. 1. Burlington Bunker. The Burlington bunker was built in 1955 beneath churches, homes, and cobblestone streets in the quaint English market town of Corsham. The subterranean network of limestone caves found here made it an ideal location for a top-secret shelter. Situated more than 100 feet below ground, the sprawling 35-acre site was constructed without the local population noticing. As a place that was meant for the British government to continue operating in the event of a nuclear attack, the bunker was bomb and radiation-proof, as well as poison gas-proof. It could accommodate as many as 4,000 central government employees for up to 3 months without any outside contact. The site was almost entirely self-sustaining, with 4 generators, an underground lake and water treatment plant, 12 fuel storage tanks, and a power station. If an all-out catastrophe struck, the Prime Minister, the entire Cabinet Office, and support staff would all have stayed in the Burlington bunker. Designed for both working and living, it contained everything they needed, including kitchens, offices, supply rooms, cafeterias, sleeping quarters, and a hospital. There was also a television and radio station for broadcasting public messages in case the need arose, as well as the country's second-largest phone exchange. Within the facility, employees communicated by sending messages through a pneumatic tube system. Measuring over a mile long, the bunker had over 60 miles of roads and a secret rail line connecting it to the main railway. It was more like an underground city rather than a shelter. But the Burlington bunker was never used, and by the time it officially closed, it was overseen by just 4 Ministry of Defense employees. Its existence was finally declassified in 2004. As it sits, frozen in time, with all its original furnishings, decorations, and supplies, its future remains uncertain. Never used ovens, coffee makers, golf carts, chairs, and other fixtures and items are scattered throughout the site as it slowly decays from neglect and dampness. Many are now fighting to preserve the Burlington bunker for its historical value, while others believe it should be repurposed and put to good use.
Early life. Henry Every was born on August 20, 1659 in the village of Newton Ferrers in Devon, England. According to parish records, he was the son of John Every and his wife Anne. The Every family was well known at the time, and Henry was most likely a kinsman of Wycroft Castle. Scholars believe that Henry was a sailor in his youth, and there are accounts of him serving on multiple Royal Navy ships. It's very likely that he was amongst those aboard the English fleet when they bombarded Algiers in 1671. Some think he was also a captain of a logwood freighter that was in the Bay of Campeche. However, those stories originated from Van Bruck's fictional memoir. It's been confirmed that during the outbreak of the 9 Years' War that occurred from 1688 and 1697 between England and its allies and King Louis XIV of France, Henry, in his 30s, worked as a midshipman on the HMS Rupert under the command of Sir Francis Wheeler. According to the ship's naval records, Henry spent little of his wages on extras such as tobacco and regularly consigned his pay to his family. In the year 1689, aboard the same ship, he helped to capture a large French convoy off the coast of Brest, France. Due to this victory, Henry had the opportunity to better his financial status and was promoted to master's mate. He was the youngest to be appointed to this position. He did so well in his role that in 1690 he was asked to join Captain Wheeler on his new ship called the HMS Albemarle. It's likely that he also participated in the Battle of Beachy Head, although this fight ended badly for the English, and Henry was discharged from the Royal Navy in late August that same year. Don't feel too bad for the man though, because in 1691 Henry became involved in the Atlantic slave trade. He then helped to transport the enslaved Africans from West Africa to the Americas under command from the Royal Governor of Bermuda, Isaac Richier. Henry operated mainly as a slave trader along the Guinea coast. Douglas Botting, an English historian, claimed that Henry was much more devious than many other practitioners of the sordid craft. Henry's activity started to make other slave traders at the time take notice of him. A Welsh slave trader known as Captain Thomas Phillips, employed by the Royal African Company, wrote about Henry in his journal. He detailed that the cynical actions of the man made the slaves from this coast more shy than usual, implying that he most likely played harsh tricks on them that caused them to feel more defeated than usual. It was during this time that Henry began to be known under his alias Long Ben, and they even thought his fake name was Every. He seemed to want his true identity to be a mystery. During his time as a slave trader, he was known to lure victims to his ship by waving flags of friendly colors. Then, once they were on board, he would capture them and chain them in his ship's hold amongst their other captives. Although we have documents that speak of Henry during these years, this part of his life was largely undocumented. Before we get into what made Henry Every king of the pirates, can you think of any other famous pirates? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Mutiny. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty. A wealthy merchant by the name of Sir James Houblon was hoping to reinvigorate the declining English economy by assembling an ambitious venture known as the Spanish Expedition Shipping in the spring of 1693. This venture would include 4 warships: the Dove, the Pink Seventh Son, Charles II, and James. Their main mission was to sail to the Spanish West Indies in order to conduct trade, recover treasure from the wrecked galleons, plunder the French possessions in the area, as well as supply the Spanish with arms. The sailors that participated in this venture were promised significant payment by investors and a guaranteed monthly wage paid out every 6 months. Naturally, Henry wanted to be a part of this. Henry was appointed as the first mate due to his experience in the Royal Navy. All 4 of the convoy ships were commanded by Admiral Sir Don Arturo O'Byrne, who was an Irish nobleman and had previously served in the Spanish Navy Marines. Right off the bat, things were going wrong with the mission. John Strong, who had been appointed as the flag captain, mysteriously died while the ship was still in port. But as they say in show business, the show must go on, and he was consequently replaced by Captain Charles Gibson. This, however, would not be the only tragedy that would occur. In August of 1693, the warships were traveling down the River Thames on their way to Spain's northern city of Corunna. This journey typically only took about 2 weeks. However, the ships did not make it to their destination until 5 months later. Even more bad luck followed because when they finally arrived at the port, their necessary legal documents failed to make it from Madrid. The ship was forced to wait until the proper paperwork arrived, and months went by without any sign of the documents. They had no money to send back home to their families, and the crew began to feel restless. The sailors requested payment from their captain, but were denied because if they had money, they would no longer be tied to the ship and could leave whenever they wanted. The men on board these ships began to think they had been sold as slaves to the Spanish. As the fleet of ships were finally preparing to leave Corunna on May 1, 1694, the men demanded their 6-month pay or else they would go on strike. Houblon, the main investor of the expedition, ultimately refused, and seeing the severity of the situation, Admiral O'Byrne wrote to England asking for the money. But this action would come far too late. Many of the sailors got into a heated argument with O'Byrne on May 6th, and it was around this time that a plan to mutiny was conceived. Henry Every began to recruit other members of the crew. There were witness accounts of him going up and down, ship by ship, to persuade men to follow him. He promised them that if they followed him, he could lead them where they would get all the money they would need. Henry had a lot of experience, and the men trusted him because he came from a lower social rank, and they felt that he would keep their best interest at heart. He won over the crew, and his plans to mutiny were underway. On May 7, 1694, while O'Byrne was sleeping, the men took their opportunity. That night, Henry and the 25 other men that had joined him rushed onto the ship Charles II and ambushed the crew on board. At the time, Captain Gibson was bedridden, and so there was miraculously no bloodshed at all. Extra crew members from the ship James pulled up along the vessel Henry had captured and recited the password they had agreed upon. "Is the drunken boatswain on board?" They then climbed on board and joined in on the mutiny. The confused captain of the ship James, obviously not understanding that Henry was leading the mutiny, called out to him and informed him that the men were deserting. The calm and collected Henry replied softly that he knew perfectly well what was happening. Now in control of Charles II, James began to fire at them, which promptly alerted the Spanish Night Watch. In order to get away without consequence, Henry Every was forced to make a run for it out onto the open sea, quickly disappearing into the dark of night. King of the Pirates. When Henry and his crew had sailed far enough away to be safe, he offered anyone on board that had not yet joined him one last chance to change their minds. He even went as far as to tell Captain Gibson that he could command the ship if he would agree to join their cause. However, he declined the proposal and was given a small boat to get him back to shore along with a few other sailors who did not want to join Henry. The only passenger who was not given the choice to leave was the ship's surgeon, because the services he could provide were far too important to lose. All of those men that were left on board Charles II unanimously elected Henry as the ship's captain. Surprisingly, the man handled the whole ordeal with a decent amount of generosity, which indicated that his motives were not just mere adventure. It wasn't hard for Henry to convince the crew to sail as pirates to the Indian Ocean. After all, their original mission was very similar to piracy, and the new captain was well known for his powers of persuasion. It's believed that he may have used Thomas Tew, a well-known pirate at the time, as an example of the riches they could receive. Tew had recently plundered a large ganja dhow in the Red Sea and had acquired treasure totaling just over 15 million euros as of 2021 in silver and gold alone. This story would have been quite motivating to the crew, and they were eager to set course for the Cape of Good Hope. Soon after he took over the ship, Henry renamed the vessel the Fancy. This name reflected the crew's newfound hope as well as the quality of the ship. It didn't take long for the men to commit their very first piracy. 3 English merchantmen from Barbados were sailing along the islands of Cape Verde when they were caught off guard by Henry's men. They robbed these 3 ships of their provisions and supplies. It's said that 9 men from these ships were convinced to join Henry's crew, and in total he then had 94 pirates at his command. They sailed to the Guinea coast, and Henry persuaded a local chieftain to board Fancy after telling him they were interested in trade. His band of pirates then forcibly stripped the chieftain and his men of their wealth, taking it for themselves. He even went as far as to keep these men as slaves after taking all of their riches. Now that Henry had come into some money, he dropped his anchor in Bioko along the African coastline in order to upgrade his ship. Fancy was raised and careened. The superstructure was cut away in order to greatly improve the ship's speed. These modifications made it one of the fastest vessels in the Atlantic Ocean. Throughout the next couple of years, Henry and his crew continued to pillage passing ships as they made their way to the Indian Ocean. Every vessel that they looted was accompanied by more men that wanted to join in on their cause. By 1695, their numbers had grown to about 150 pirates in total. Their success promptly gained the attention of the East India Company, who had giant, powerful ships at their disposal and were the only real threat Fancy faced while in the Indian Ocean. Henry and his army of pirates then set sail for the volcanic island called Perim in mid-1695. Their plan was to lie and wait for an Indian fleet that would be passing through the area. This fleet of ships was easily the most profitable prize in Asia, maybe even the entire world. In order to pull off the massive heist, Henry joined 5 other pirate captains, including Thomas Tew. And although Tew had the most experience, Henry was ultimately elected as the admiral of the entire pirate flotilla. With all of these pirates together, he was now in charge of over 440 men, who were all now waiting for the Indian fleet to pass. Some of the other pirate captains' ships were too slow to keep up with Fancy, and they were left behind when they heard news that the fleet had managed to elude them and were now being seen in the Straits of Surat. A high-speed chase quickly ensued between the pirates and this Indian fleet. When they finally caught up with them in open waters, a battle of massive proportions began. The pirates boarded the fleet's ships, and a hand-to-hand battle began, lasting roughly 2 to 3 hours. There were plenty of casualties on both sides. However, in the end, Henry and his crew arose victorious, making off with a huge amount of treasure, roughly $42.4 million today. This attack by Henry threatened the existence of English trade in India when the stories of the pirates quickly spread. And so, a manhunt for the pirate crew was coordinated by the Board of Trade. Parliament was offering €500, $270,000 today, for Henry Every's head in 1696. And because of this, every bounty hunter and adventurer in the English-speaking world was on the lookout for him. He managed to disguise himself as a slave trader and set sail for the Bahamas, where he could buy protection. When he arrived at the capital city of Nassau, he bribed a military officer for safe passage, and it was then that his crew split up. Henry himself disappeared in June 1696 and was never heard from again. Some theories say he died in poverty, but it could just be that Henry Every got away with all of his crimes and was able to spend the rest of his days enjoying his vast stolen fortune. Whatever the case may be, Henry became known to many as the King of Pirates. Do you think that you would have what it takes to be a pirate? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.